Good afternoon. My name is Ramin Fatehi, and I am the Commonwealth's attorney for the city of Norfolk. I am here to speak to you today about an important incident that happened on June the 21st of 2022 here in the city of Norfolk. It involved the police's use of force in their efforts to arrest an individual in the 5500 block of Monroe Avenue, just off of Bowling Avenue in the Larchmont section of Norfolk. That incident resulted in the death of one individual, a man by the name of Antonio Beekman. This incident led to an investigation by the state police, and ultimately I received a report of that incident with a very narrow but very important responsibility to the officers involved, to the state police, to the family of Mr. Beekman, and to the public in the city of Norfolk and in Hampton Roads at large, which was to decide, were there criminal charges to bring? If so, who was at fault? What those charges would be. Having reviewed the evidence that the state police has offered to me, which included body camera video, ballistics evidence, forensic evidence, interviews of the individuals involved, including multiple Norfolk and Virginia Beach police officers, and other forensic evidence, I have concluded this. The Norfolk police officers involved in this case, Officer Brian Kahn, Officer Joshua Jeffcoat, Officer Leroy Lewis, and Officer Vincent Taco, were faced with the use of force on the part of Antonio Beekman. Mr. Beekman was the first person to shoot in this incident. He exposed those officers to the possibility of grave injury or death, and also exposed others to that. The officers in this case responded with the only option they had available to them in a very dangerous and split-second moment, which was to meet deadly force with deadly force to protect themselves, their colleagues, and the public at large. They committed no crime. They did what we ask of police officers to do every day, which is to make hard decisions while under fire and while facing violence that they must answer. There are no charges for my office to bring against those officers. My analysis reveals that had Mr. Beekman lived, and I wish he had, I think we all do, but had Mr. Beekman lived, he would have been subject to a number of criminal charges, violent felonies that resulted out of this incident, and that would have been in addition to the violent felonies that for which he was wanted at the time of this incident. My final conclusion will be that there will be no charges to bring and that this case will be closed. Let me explain to you how I've reached that conclusion. To do that requires us not to start on the 21st of June, but to go back to late May of 2022. In late May, early in the morning of May the 30th, roughly 1 o'clock in the morning, a 7-Eleven teller was working at a convenience store on Holland Road in the city of Virginia Beach. That clerk at the 7-Eleven had a teenager come in and try to buy tobacco products. The clerk had turned that teenager away, and shortly thereafterwards, Mr. Beekman came into that 7-Eleven. The clerk and Mr. Beekman did not know each other. Mr. Beekman came in and bought tobacco, and the clerk watched Mr. Beekman go out and give that tobacco to the teenager. The clerk happened to be going on break and spoke to Mr. Beekman and said, "Please don't do that. That gets me in trouble, it gets you in trouble, I could get fined." I know this because of the police report that we've obtained from Virginia Beach and my conversations with that witness. The conversation appeared to have ended peacefully, and Mr. Beekman left the scene. A very short time thereafter, Mr. Beekman returned, armed with a 9mm pistol, and took multiple shots at that 7-Eleven clerk, shooting the 7-Eleven clerk in the foot and wounding him. Mr. Beekman then left the scene. The clerk called 911. He did not know Mr. Beekman. He had never dealt with him before. The Virginia Beach answered the call. Virginia Beach police answered the call, came in, were able to speak to the clerk, to another eyewitness. They were able to collect a spent 9mm shell casing, and they were able to pull other evidence from the store, including a transaction record that linked to Mr. Beekman's credit card account that allowed the Virginia Beach police to identify Mr. Beekman as the shooter. The Virginia Beach police charged Mr. Beekman with the malicious wounding of that clerk. In addition, while Mr. Beekman was not charged with other offenses, Mr. Beekman was legally prohibited from possessing a firearm, let alone using it to wound someone. He had prior felony convictions, including a conviction for armed robbery from the early 2000s that would have subjected him to the charge of possessing a firearm as a convicted felon. The Virginia Beach Police Warrant and Fugitive Unit were called in to try and find Mr. Beekman and to take Mr. Beekman into custody on this arrest warrant. They were able to determine that Mr. Beekman worked driving trucks. They tried to go to Mr. Beekman's place of work. He began work early in the day and worked late into the night. They weren't able to arrest him where he worked, but they were able to figure out that Mr. Beekman lived at an apartment in a complex on Monroe Avenue in Larchmont. And after determining which apartment Mr. Beekman lived in, determining which car he normally drove, they called up the Norfolk police and, as a standard procedure, alerted the Norfolk police to the fact that there was a wanted individual in their city for a violent crime, and asked for the Norfolk Police's assistance in taking Mr. Beekman into custody. The Norfolk Police agreed, and that task fell largely to the Norfolk Police Special Operations Team. The Special Operations Team is a unit of highly trained, highly specialized, and hand-picked officers who are known for their courage, known for their cool heads, known for their willingness to take on the most dangerous assignments in the city. They have special weapons training, they have marksman's training, they have training in the arrest of individuals and the service of search warrants. And the Virginia Beach Police were asking for help not just with Mr. Beekman's arrest, but also with the service of a search warrant on Mr. Beekman's apartment to try and find more evidence that might have been related to the malicious wounding of the 7-Eleven clerk. The plan was to arrest Mr. Beekman on the morning of June the 21st of 2022 and to take him into custody, hopefully peaceably, as he was beginning his day. Before 5 o'clock that morning, a number of Virginia Beach Police Warrant and Fugitive Unit detectives were out at the scene on Monroe Place in unmarked cars, themselves in plain clothes, to be the surveillance unit and to spot Mr. Beekman and to alert the Norfolk Police and the Special Operations Team to make the arrest. The Special Operations Team requested volunteers, and the 4 officers, Officer Kahn, Officer Lewis, Officer Jeffcoat, and Officer Taco, volunteered to be the arrest unit with other Special Operations Team members serving as the units that would assist with searching Mr. Beekman's apartment following his arrest. The 4 officers were dressed in tactical clothing. It was a dark police uniform with the words police across the front and back, a badge, their standard issue .45 caliber semi-automatic pistols, and our SR-16 rifles. They're long rifles that are specially issued to the Special Operations Team. These 4 officers were in a Chevrolet Suburban, a black Chevrolet Suburban, which you can see in this scene that we will discuss more. It was an unmarked Norfolk Police unit. It was one of the Special Operations Team vehicles, and they showed up shortly before 5 a.m. and were posted by Larchmont Elementary School, waiting for further instructions from the Virginia Beach Police Department. In addition, there were the units that would have assisted with the search of the apartment were in further reserve. Mr. Beekman came out of his apartment. His apartment was some distance away across a grassy field from where his car was parked. The warrant and fugitive unit were able to determine that this Nissan that you see here in this scene was a car that Mr. Beekman drove. That's in fact one of the reasons why unmarked units were posted in various places to look for Mr. Beekman's car. They see Mr. Beekman come out, they give the signal to the 4 Special Operations Team officers saying that Mr. Beekman was on the move. Mr. Beekman at that point did not appear to be armed. Once the Special Operations Team officers heard that Mr. Beekman was on the move, they immediately start moving themselves. Officer Kahn, who was the driver, they put the car in gear, pulled the car up to within roughly, as you can see, the front bumper to back bumper of the car where Mr. Beekman had been headed. The officers turned on their body cam. In fact, Officer Taco was the one who reminded everyone, body cams, everybody turns on their body cams. And what happens afterwards moves extremely quickly. As you will see yourselves as I play certain portions of the body cam, out of respect for Mr. Beekman and out of respect for his family, I will not play all of it. It is difficult to watch, but I will play the portions that will reflect, or that will show and support the conclusions that I have reached. The officers pull up, everybody opens their doors. As the officers are climbing out of the car, their headlight and taillights are on, no blue lights, but headlights and taillights. The officers step out, and as you'll see on the body camera video, the officers may not have even had feet on the ground. The only words that any of the officers are able to get out are from Officer Lewis, whose job was going to be the lead person to approach from the front passenger door to come and try and get Mr. Beekman into custody. And you'll be able to hear, "Show me your hands, show me your," and even before the word hands comes out, you will hear gunfire. The interviews with the officers establish that at that point, Officer Lewis, in particular, as he explained, saw Mr. Beekman firing at him. Mr. Beekman was in fact armed. He draws a gun and he starts shooting at the officers. The officers at that point make the decision that they must, which is if somebody is shooting at them, they must shoot back. Not just to protect themselves, but to protect everybody in this neighborhood. And that is exactly what they do. The Officer Lewis explained, and you'll see on the video, that he took cover. He was able to fire a few rounds from his long rifle, takes cover behind this Lincoln SUV. The other 3 officers are able to fan out and move in various directions. The body camera does not show the beginning of this fire, this exchange of fire. You will hear it, but you won't see it. But you will see that Mr. Beekman starts to move back towards his apartment. Interviews with the officers show that Mr. Beekman, even while moving backwards, continued to shoot at the officers. He eventually falls and dies, if not instantly, then very close to it, from multiple gunshot wounds. By the time that the officers arrive up to him, Mr. Beekman was beyond any kind of medical help. I'll play the video and then we'll talk about some of the ballistics and forensic evidence that confirms the account that the officers have given and interlocks with the body camera video and shows that Mr. Beekman in fact fired first and that the officers responded as their training and as public safety required. Once we play through this, I'll also explain some additional information regarding the gun that was in Mr. Beekman's possession and the subsequent forensic analysis, both of that gun and of other evidence on the scene. Now, here, as I mentioned to you, this is Officer Kahn, Officer Lewis, Officer Jeffcoat, and Officer Taco, synchronized by the Virginia State Police in their investigation. I viewed the videos individually. These are the videos. And each of these videos is in the position where the officer was in the car. Make sure our Please pay attention roughly at second 17. That's where things will happen very quickly, and then I will play them again. That sound, by the way, was not a gunshot. That was the sound of somebody's breakfast falling off of the dashboard of the car. Right here, you will be able to see this is Mr. Beekman's car. Within a few seconds, you'll be able to see Mr. Beekman on Officer Kahn's body camera running in this direction. Remember that Officer Lewis is going to be the lead officer as he gets out of the car. He is the one who's going to be physically closest to Mr. Beekman. He will also be the one who says, "Let me see your hands." Mr. Beekman. The Norfolk police could, in theory, investigate itself. There is no law in Virginia that prevents it. However, for a number of years, the Norfolk police have followed what I consider to be national best practices, which is any time that there is the wounding or the death of an individual as a result of the police use of force, they do not investigate themselves. They call the Virginia State Police, and they make their officers available and themselves available to the Virginia State Police to conduct an independent investigation of the use of force. And pursuant to this incident, they called the Virginia State Police. They also called me. And the Virginia State Police responded to the scene, as did I personally, so that I could observe the scene firsthand. I could feel confident both in the quality of the investigation and to be able to see and taste and hear and feel the things that no video or no police report could capture. I consider that to be part of my personal duties and my personal obligations to our citizens. The state police, the Norfolk police and the state police together sealed off the scene. The state police collected a good deal of forensic evidence, which included shell casings from the guns that the 4 officers had fired, and shell casings and the gun itself from Mr. Beekman. The one thing that the body camera does not capture in that segment that I played for you, but that you can see very clearly in another segment, is that when the police recover the gun, it is magazine side down, and the part of the gun that is called a slide is all the way back. What that means for a semi-automatic pistol is that to understand what that means for a semi-automatic pistol, we have to talk about how a semi-automatic pistol works. Semi-automatic pistols have a magazine of cartridges, each cartridge being a bullet and a shell casing and gunpowder. They chamber or hold a bullet ready to shoot and that bullet feeds into the frame of the gun and is held there by a spring-fed mechanism. When an individual pulls the trigger on a semi-automatic pistol, the hammer on the pistol hits the primer, ignites the gunpowder, and fires the bullet out of the gun. At that point, the force of the ejection of the bullet and the force of the gunpowder itself sends the spring mechanism on the slide of the gun at the top backwards. That sets off a two-step process inside the gun. One is to eject a shell casing, and the other is to trigger the feeding of another bullet from the magazine into the chamber of the gun. That is why it is semi-automatic. One pull of the trigger is one bullet, but every pull of the trigger feeds the next bullet ready for the next pull of the trigger. The significance of the slide of this gun being locked back is that the slide of a gun gets locked back in two main situations. One is in the case that the gun is jammed, in which case a cartridge will sit in the ejection port, or, as in this case, the slide locks back because there are no more no more cartridges left in the magazine to feed into the mechanism. So once one spends everything left in one's magazine, as incidentally we saw on the body camera video, the slide locks back. The gun, as the police found it next to Mr. Beekman, was locked back like this, which meant that Mr. Beekman not only opened fire on the officers, but he fired every round he had. The body camera obviously does not show the initial and crucial few seconds. The forensics at the scene substantiate, however, the officer's account of what happened. If you watched carefully, the officers climb out of the car, and really the only words that they were able to get out of their mouths, and only one of the four of them, was, "Let me see your hands, let me see your," and almost at the point of hands, you hear gunfire erupt. The bullets and the shell casings recovered at the scene are consistent with Mr. Beekman's firing at them. If we go back to our view here, this again was Mr. Beekman's car. Officer Lewis describes coming out of this door, immediately hearing gunfire, taking cover behind this Lincoln SUV. He describes hearing the hiss of gas as he is back there. The state police, in the course of their investigation, were able to find three very important pieces of evidence. One is here at item number 45. One does not have an item number, but will have some photographs, and the third the same. The item number 45 right here is a spent bullet. That spent bullet is a 9mm bullet that ballistics testing links to Mr. Beekman's gun. It was fired from Mr. Beekman's gun. That is one of Mr. Beekman's bullets. In addition, the police took a look at the front of that Lincoln SUV. This is the Lincoln, Mr. Beekman's car, in front of it. The police SUV would have been very close to where this photographer was standing. He may have even been touching it when he was there. These flags go through and show the path of a bullet. while the police were not in a position to essentially to cause serious damage to the car of a third party, they were able to see that a bullet had penetrated the front of the car, behind which, if you recall, Officer Lewis had taken cover. The only way that that bullet could have moved in that direction and pierced the front of this car was if Mr. Beekman had shot that round. That I can say with confidence that is Mr. Beekman's round. The fact that Officer Lewis was able to say that he heard the hiss of gas is indicative of probably hitting the air conditioning compressor of that car. More importantly, in fact, more frighteningly, was the examination of the officer's car. You've already seen the video, so I think you'll appreciate the significance of what I'm about to show you. This is the SUV. These two rounds are from Officer Kahn, shell casings belonging to Officer Kahn. Round number 25 is a shell casing from Officer Lewis. This is an unmarked but very important piece of evidence. Zooming in, you see what it is. It's a bullet hole. This is the front of that door. This is the frame of the door out of which Officer Lewis was in the process of getting out. This round penetrated through, this way, outside to inside, at some point either while Officer Lewis was here or while Officer Lewis was here, and thankfully not while Officer Lewis was here. That is not a round that could have been fired by the police. It was a round that, but for being a foot in either direction, would have hit Officer Lewis. The only way that that round could have penetrated this part of this car was if Mr. Beekman had taken that shot. There is no bullet to correspond to it. That is not unusual in these situations, because the bullet either can fragment into pieces, it can go down range, it can bounce, it can drop, it can roll into a gutter, but there is no other way for that hole to have wound up in this car other than for Mr. Beekman to have taken that shot. And I can't think of any more clear demonstration of the sort of danger that Mr. Beekman put these officers in and the kind of split-second decision that they had to make, that other than the fact that one of the officers, or arguably both, depending on who's climbing out of the car when, could have been in the path of that bullet. The forensic collection and ballistic analysis from from the scene yielded 9 9mm shell casings, all of which matched ballistically to the gun that you saw in Mr. Beekman's hand. The bullet that I showed you as item number 45 also matched to Mr. Beekman's gun. Remember, he was the only person on scene who had a 9mm pistol. The officers, 3 fired .45 caliber pistols, and 1 fired a long rifle of a totally different caliber. The ballistic analysis of the officers' shell casings, the police recovered all of the shell casings that the officers had fired, and some bullets, some from the autopsy, some from the scene itself. Those bullets and the shell casings were fanned out consistently with the movements that you saw of the officers on the body camera video. The autopsy of Mr. Beekman also substantiates that all of the shooting started very early and is consistent with Mr. Beekman's starting this incident. spoken about the ballistics, the moving to the autopsy. The medical examiner was able to identify 21 gunshot wounds to Mr. Beekman. The medical examiner was able to recover some projectiles, not all. Some of the wounds were through and through. Some of at least one of the projectiles were fragmented. The medical examiner is able to determine the direction of travel of various wounds, not all. It can be difficult to tell sometimes. What a medical examiner cannot do is necessarily say who was where or doing what at any given point, or the sequence at which a person suffers various gunshot wounds if they're in short order. So number 1 doesn't mean the first wound, number 19 doesn't mean the last, or moving on to the 21st. It's simply a numbering system that the medical examiner uses. So please don't assign any particular significance to the numbers. What the medical examiner's report does show, and what is important to my analysis, is that no fewer than, I want to make sure I get my number correct. No fewer than 6 to 7 of the wounds that Mr. Beekman suffered were either to the front of his body or to the side of his body. The remainder were essentially to the rear of his body, or were at certain angles where it was clear that the wounds were most likely from when he was on the ground. Still gun in hand, if we recall. This substantiates and backs up, again, in a different way, that the police were engaged in an exchange of gunfire with someone facing them. And is consistent with Mr. Beekman's being the first to fire. The officers in this case spoke to the investigators. They gave their statements. The only people who were really in a good position to see what had happened were the 4 officers and the lead SOT team. Everything happened so quickly and happened based on where people were standing that the Virginia Beach officers were able to come to the scene, but by the time that they even realized that something had been happening, the same with the SOT backup team. They were not in a position, they hadn't been in a position to be able to see the details of the incident. But the evidence all pointed in one direction. I'll add as a coda that the police department did eventually serve the search warrant on Mr. Beekman's house later in the day. The legal analysis in this case, once the evidence fit together, was relatively straightforward. Thanks to an effort on the part of the General Assembly during the 2020 session that saw a number of criminal justice reforms passed and a number of accountability laws and guidelines passed. We have a code section in Virginia, Code Section 19.2-83.5, that describes certain guidelines that prosecutors and others should use in evaluating whether the use of deadly force is justified. Those guidelines are largely in line with the rulings from the United States Supreme Court and the Virginia Supreme Court on these issues. Now, I'll add, by the way, that in this case, the analysis would have been essentially identical, regardless of whether the 4 individuals in this case were officers or whether they were lay people. The analysis is clear. In each instance, if someone is being met with what a reasonable person in that position, not a Monday morning quarterback, but a reasonable person in that position, if they are faced with the use or the imminent threat of deadly force against themselves or some other person, they are entitled to respond with deadly force. The use of deadly force in this case you can hear, and eventually through the interlocking pieces of the forensic analysis you can see was something that the officers faced. They were taking cover. They were taking fire. In fact, it is safe to say that one of them nearly got shot. In that moment, as you saw, as we were all watching, sitting here in a conference room, that moment happened very quickly. They did not have the luxury of determining what was going on beyond the fact that they were being shot at. The standards that the code section uses are this. First, does a law enforcement officer reasonably believe that deadly force is immediately necessary to protect himself or another? We have answered that question. If feasible, and these are important words for where we're going, has provided a warning to the subject that he will use deadly force. Not feasible in this case. The officer barely had time to say, let me see your hands. Did not even have time to make any other kind of announcement before Mr. Beekman opened fire. 3, and this is the larger question, the officer's actions are reasonable given the totality. I've explained why, and they are in fact reasonable. All other options have been exhausted or do not reasonably lend themselves to the circumstances. And this was not a slow motion situation. This was not an individual armed with a knife or some other deadly weapon that would have allowed for some form of negotiation. This was a very rapid situation that broke bad very quickly, and broke bad based not on the decision, that broke bad at the crucial point where Mr. Beekman elected to open fire. The code section goes on and describes some duplicative ideas, but some of the other things that they say you can determine, circumstances you can use, are the amount of time available to the law enforcement officer, again, some duplicative, whether the subject possessed or appeared to possess a deadly weapon, whether he refused to comply. We definitely have a refusal for compliance here. Whether the officer is engaged in de-escalation measures, and that's a standard that is if feasible. It's not a reasonable expectation to look for a de-escalation when somebody has nearly shot you. We just do not have that luxury, nor should we expect that sort of luxury in a split-second, very dangerous situation. That is a standard that is important, but is really geared towards other instances where things have developed. A classic example not here would be in a barricade situation, for example. That would be a very important consideration. It's just not one that is realistic or feasible to apply to the facts before us today. Whether the conduct of the law enforcement officer intentionally increased the risk of a confrontation, there's no evidence that there was an intentional effort to provoke a confrontation or to escalate. The officers got the signal to come in, they drove in, they began to get out of their car and began to get shot at. There is no intentional escalation. And the seriousness of the suspected crime. Please remember again, the information that the SOT officers had was that they were going to be arresting an individual who was wanted for malicious wounding, malicious shooting, was suspected to be armed and dangerous. And therefore, they had to be on their guard and they had to be prepared for the possibility of dealing with an armed and dangerous individual. I'll end where I began. This has been a very difficult situation for everyone. I know it has been very difficult for Mr. Beekman's family. It is tough to lose a loved one. I wish they hadn't. They have not done anything wrong. However, the fault in this case lies with Mr. Beekman. And this hasn't just been tough on him. Anytime officers take a life, they have to live with that. They have to live with it. Even when they did the absolute right thing, I have known officers in my 17 years prosecuting for whom it is very difficult very, very difficult. They second-guess themselves, even when they did the right thing. You know, and they think and rethink about, could we have done something differently? These officers did the best they could. They made the kinds of difficult and lethal decisions that we ask officers to make so that the rest of us don't have to. And I know that it's been a long road between the police investigation and the time that I have taken to review this case carefully and make sure that I got it right, for them to be left not knowing what was going to happen. But we need to express our appreciation. I express my appreciation to these officers. They followed their training. They made the decisions that they had to make. I'm sorry that the outcome was the outcome that it was, but this could have gone differently had Mr. Beekman not drawn the gun and not fired. Please forgive me. I think I forgot a very important fact in this. I mentioned that the Virginia Beach police had recovered a shell casing at the scene of the shooting on May the 30th. Ballistic analysis connected that shell casing to the very same gun that Mr. Beekman used on the morning he died. It was the same gun. I finally want to end with general observations. My job as Commonwealth's attorney is to be the Chief Minister of Justice for the city. It is to look at every use of force, whether it is civilians versus civilians, or officers against civilians, and to do it neutrally, to do it objectively, to do it with a cold eye, and to hold accountable those who break our laws and those who engage in violence. No one is above the law. However, when anybody, whether it is a civilian, but especially when a police officer uses force in a method that is justified, I have a moral and a legal obligation to the citizens of the city of Norfolk to explain that they have done so. These officers did what they had to do, and for that we owe them our thanks. I will finally thank both the Virginia State Police and the Norfolk Police. Nothing inspires public confidence like transparency. Nothing inspires confidence like being willing to let an outside agency look at your people. The fact that the Norfolk Police do this is not every agency does. And this is what we expect out of 21st century policing. And the high quality work that the state police did put me in a position where instead of having to tell you I don't know or tell you I'm not sure, I feel confident in my conclusions. And for that, we all, again, as citizens, owe them our thanks. Thank you for your attention to this important matter. We have some members of the press here in the room, and I will be happy to take whatever questions I'm at liberty to answer.
So we know this happened over a year ago, but today, is the case officially closed?
Yes. My job, again, is as a criminal inquiry. This case is closed. The criminal inquiry is absolutely closed.
With the case now being closed, we know that those 4 officers, when this originally happened, was placed on administrative leave. Are they back with the Norfolk Police Department?
I alerted the Norfolk Police Department today, as I alerted you today. The administrative procedures of the Norfolk Police are not part of my portfolio. They are respectful of my prerogatives, and I'm respectful of theirs. They have some additional processes, as I understand it, to follow administratively before they make any decisions on the officers. Those are not things that are subject to my control or to my oversight. I trust them to do the right thing and to take whatever time they need. But I would be speaking out of turn to discuss exactly what would happen or on what timeline.
Are you able to share with us just what Beekman's other, outstanding warrants were for?
There was the one warrant for malicious wounding. There could have theoretically been other charges. I can't speak to why the charging decision in Virginia Beach happened. Typically what happens is officers go before a Virginia magistrate and swear out a warrant. But it was a crime that didn't even happen in Norfolk. So I have very good information about it, but limited. And the important part of that, at least for my analysis, was that this was a violent crime whether it had been 1 charge or 3 charges, the incident was the incident. And the way that incident happened also was something that shed some light in Mr. Beekman, unfortunately, is not here to tell us what happened, but it does give me some insight into what the decision-making might have been. Mr. Beekman presumably knew that he had shot a 7-Eleven clerk some weeks before, that could not have been out of his mind as he was making whatever the decisions that he was making that morning.
And just for clarification, Ramin, he did live, did he or did he not live in the largemouth area?
He lived in the apartment complex that was across that grassy field.
Got it, okay.
So he did live there. That was, in fact, what permitted the Virginia Beach police to track him there. They were able to determine that he leased an apartment in that complex.
Thank you.
Are you able to divulge whether or not he lived alone?
I can't say with any certainty. I know that there was at least one other person with him early that morning. Out of respect for everybody's privacy, I don't want to get into that because it's not relevant to the analysis. That's, I think, as much as it would be appropriate for me to say. Whether one person had lived there, Mr. Beekman alone, Mr. Beekman with 10 other people, the analysis of what criminal charges there were to bring, if any, all of that happened after Mr. Beekman left the apartment.
The warrant was executed on his house later that afternoon. Was anything of note found or that impacted the case?
No impact on the case. I'm not aware of anything substantial coming out of it. Really, the most important thing to discover in that instance would have been a gun to link to the crime, and the gun that linked Mr. Beekman to the crime is the very gun that linked him to this criminal incident.
Was there any footage from that May 30th 7-Eleven shooting? So just reading through here, seems to say that it really was him. Was Beekman identified by the clerk, or what can you say about that?
I'm not sure. I had some written materials from Virginia Beach. I had more than enough between that material and with speaking to the clerk myself and the fact that a credit card transaction record linked Mr. Beekman there, plus the forensics, the shell casing, to be able to say that the police were totally reasonable in expecting that Mr. Beekman was the criminal actor there. The only other explanation, which is totally not reasonable, is some other person had Mr. Beekman's credit card and his gun and went out to Virginia Beach and shot somebody, and then Mr. Beekman was in possession of the gun later. So it would have been an important piece of evidence, either to exist or not to exist, were there going to be a Virginia Beach court case to try Mr. Beekman. But it wasn't going to be a determinative fact, and I did not run that down just to see it or not to see it. Any other questions? Thank you, everyone, for your attention. I know the weather's ugly out there. Please be safe. Please don't flood your cars. And God bless.